Good evening and welcome to National Council of Jewish Women Arizona's webinar on Your Vote and the Courts. We're delighted to have everybody join us tonight with these wonderful, wonderful, amazing guests. But first, I would like to just say that for those who are not familiar with the National Council of Jewish Women, we are a grassroots progressive organization whose mission is to protect rights and freedoms and improve the lives of women, children, and families. We do this within a framework of reproductive justice. And as such, the issue of the courts is integral to who we are and what we are as an organization. For more than 2 decades, through its benchmark campaign, NCJW has been a leading voice in the progressive community's fight to ensure a fair and independent judiciary. The composition of the federal courts defines how justice is delivered in this nation. So we are delighted to have you with us. I'm Sivia Tamarkin, and I'm the president of the Arizona section. And I would like to point out that when we planned this webinar, because of the interconnection between voting and the courts, we had no idea that we would be as timely and as critical as we are now. We planned this back in August. I believe it certainly was before Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death and before the rush to fill her spot.
Right.
So it turns out that this is more relevant than ever. I also would like our audience to know that NCJW, because of our commitment to a fair, unbiased, impartial judiciary, has mobilized now more than 1 million people through our hashtag Courts Matter campaign and our hashtag Roots Revolution campaign to oppose the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court and to honor Justice Ginsburg's dying wish that the seat only be filled after every vote is counted. We have mobilized petition signatures, emails, phone calls to senators, and our letter opposing the process of confirming a candidate prior to the election was just entered into the official record during the judiciary hearings by Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut. So we're very proud of that. And not only was it National's letter, but this section was a signatory to the letter as well. Tonight's webinar is the first in a series of programs under a trademarked initiative called You Be the Judge, which is NCJW's project to make people aware of the judiciary. Tonight we have our webinar and discussion, and in the spring we plan to have an interactive exercise, a type of moot court, designed to help groups learn about the federal judiciary. And our board member, Attorney Ellison Kierman, is heading up that effort. We hope to have students, high schoolers, college students, lay people who want to understand more about how the courts work sign up for this. But the sad reality is that at state, county, and municipal level, too many people do not pay attention to the judiciary positions on the ballot. If you have not yet voted, if you are still planning to send in your mail-in ballot or vote in person, please make sure that you check your state judicial evaluations and performance reviews. Because the interconnection of voting and the courts is critical. We now have the same dark money, the same groups like the Federalist Society that were rushing to fill positions on the courts, both the appellate and the Supreme Court, are now leading the way to suppress voters. They are the same people behind so many initiatives to thwart voting in states across the country. And it is the same effort. If one thinks about this as a conspiracy, you only need to go to the Center for Responsive Politics investigation. You only need to read Rhode Island Senator Whitehouse's testimony at the congressional hearings. But there most definitely is the same concerted effort by the Federalist Society and a spin-off group called the Judicial Crisis Network and their backers to influence the propaganda that mail-in voting is rigged, and they have been encouraging Colorado, Florida, Michigan, and other states to use misleading data. They've asked for voter rolls to be purged. So the Honest Election Project, which is an offshoot, despite its name, of this dark money effort, is filed suit. And there is a pipeline now of federal suits making its way to the courts, as more than 27 million people have already filed dropped off their ballots or mailed in their ballots. So tonight we would like to discuss, how did we get to this place? In the last 4 years, the Trump administration, in collaboration with Senate Republican leader McConnell, have put, I believe, 217 judges on the federal bench. That's more than a third, or about a third, of the federal judiciary. And that, of course, affects our lives. It will affect decisions about voter suppression. And moving beyond this election, it will affect everything from environmental decisions, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, gerrymandering, etc., etc. So we are delighted to have an incredible panel with us tonight to discuss this. First, I'd like to introduce, going alphabetically, Michelle Bratcher Goodwin, who holds the Chancellor's Chair at the University of California, Irvine Law School. She has appointments not just at the law school, but in health sciences and gender and sexuality studies. She is the founder and director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy and its Reproductive Justice Initiative. She founded the Institute of Global Child Advocacy as well. She is widely published in newspapers, magazines. She's the author of several books, including her latest, Policing the Womb, about the criminalization of pregnancy, which I am very proud to have written a jacket blurb for. And she is an elected fellow at the American Bar Association. She serves on the executive committee of the American Civil Liberties Union, elected member of the American Law Institute, and currently the host of Ms. Magazine's podcast on the issues. So welcome, Michelle. Judge Glenda Hatchett has over 30 years of experience as a judge, corporate attorney, board member of Fortune 500 companies and nonprofit organizations. She was the first chief presiding judge of Fulton County, Georgia's juvenile court, and the first African American chief presiding judge of a state court in Georgia, one of the largest juvenile court systems in the country. She, as I mentioned, has served on numerous Fortune 500 and nonprofit boards. She was a consultant to the National Basketball Association on legal issues, and she has been an advisor to the CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates nonprofit organization, which I'm proud to say NCJW Arizona founded the Arizona chapter of that. And in addition to being widely published and the author of 2 books, she also is a television host of her own court series, The Verdict. So welcome, Judge Hatchett.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And now, last but not least, Jill Wine-Banks, MSNBC analyst, appearing regularly on the network's primetime and daytime shows. She began her career as the first woman organized crime prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, which led to her selection as one of 3 assistant special prosecutors and the only woman in the case against President Richard Nixon's top aides for obstruction of justice in the Watergate scandal. She also served as general counsel of the U.S. Army. She was partner in law firm Jenner & Block, first Solicitor General and first woman Deputy Attorney General for the state of Illinois, and the first woman Chief Operating Officer of the American Bar Association. Jill is the author of the book, The Watergate Girl, co-host of the podcast, Intergenerational Politics. And I'd like to add that she was the keynote featured speaker at NCJW-AZ's luncheon last March, just under the wire before the country went into shutdown. And I would like to give a very self-serving plug at this point, that because of COVID, our next event will be March 7th. It will be a virtual gala, and I want everyone to save the date. It will be a cocktail hour on virtual platforms. And if you are interested, you will be getting a save the date. You will be getting email notices and invitations. But if you are interested in being a sponsor, a corporate sponsor, an individual donor, please contact NCJWAZ at ncjwaz.org. And now that I've put in that plug, I'd like to start, if I might, with Michelle. How did we get to this terrible point of having a third of the judges on the federal bench be the inexperienced, unqualified, many of them according to the American Bar Association, appointees of this administration?
There are 2 ways that we can think about that. And thank you for having me, Sylvia. It's so wonderful to be with you and the community here, the co-panelists. It's really an honor. There are 2 ways that we can think about this. One is the backlash against President Barack Obama. And if we think about this just within the Trump administration, then we're failing to understand what was happening, especially between 2010 and 2015, the rise of the Tea Party, Senator Mitch McConnell pandering to some of the instincts of people who were coming to Washington, D.C. with racialized effigies. It was very interesting at the time that many reporters that I hear from now say that, well, at the time they really weren't catching the racism of all of that, even though the effigies were really quite racialized with images of President Barack Obama with bones through the nose and very exaggerated kinds of features. If you go back during that time and you look at websites that were being developed, there were websites that were calling for the death of Mrs. Obama as well as their kids, and not just 1 or 2, but there were a whole host of them. And what that meant in terms of the Senate was a blocking of so many of the candidates that the Obama administration had wanted to put forward. So it's not as if these vacancies just occurred now. These were vacancies that were held over from the Obama administration, where the administration was not able to get folks through. You know, strategically, I think it's also another point that we need to think about too is with Merrick Garland. He did not get a hearing months before the election. And I think it's worth wondering about the strategy of Merrick Garland, someone who was completely well qualified for the court, no doubt about that. But whether there should have been a woman who was nominated, she still might not have gotten her day, but the very protest that came about in January might have been coming. forward months before, because it would have been very difficult to wait for Mitch McConnell and the others to justify why a very qualified woman couldn't get her hearing. No one was going to get out in the streets, sadly, and they didn't, for Judge Merrick Garland, even though he's exceptionally qualified for the seat. So what does this say about strategizing? But I'd also say something else is that we reach this moment. It's a moment that's been percolating in our history for some time. Of the hundreds of people that you just talked about who have been confirmed now, if we look just at the federal appellate bench, of the 53 as of July that had been confirmed by the court, not one Black person, not one Latino. This has been absolutely unheard of if you look at the last 4, 5, 6 presidents going back half a century, right? And so we have to reconcile with what is happening in our country at this moment, which has been happening, percolating underground for a long time, which is, deeply embedded racism. And being able to use the terminology of racism and white supremacy, which is really important that we are able to speak honestly about these histories and culture in our nation. And that too, it must be a part of this discussion. I'll close with just the final point, which is that at this point, President Trump has been able to nominate, and the Senate has confirmed, more judges than he has been able to confirm, get through the process, more judges than any other president save George Washington. And that, I think, really puts this in context.
Sylvia, could I add something to
Yes,
that? Because
please.
of course, I absolutely agree with everything Michelle said, but I think it's also because the Republicans saw the courts as a way to get to their goals, and they focused on it in a way that Democrats never have. They set out a strategy to elect people both at the governor's level, in the state houses, and to the Senate in order to get the kind of control that they needed to stop Obama from getting his appointees, and then when Trump became president, to get the people they wanted, despite lack of qualification for many of them. Democrats didn't even mention the courts in the Democratic convention this year. Think how many times courts were mentioned in the Republican convention. And that will show you where the priority is. And to me, it's a big mistake, because the courts have been one of the only things that has protected many of the rights we all hold dear, all the things that we value in a democracy right now, while the administration is passing policies that most people listening to this would find abhorrent, do find abhorrent.
Exactly. I wanted to add, how does this period compare to what we saw under other Republican administrations? I mean, going back to Nixon, and I'll stick with you for a moment, Jill, because you were in the Justice Department then. Going back to Nixon, we did not see the staunch ideological appointees in the same way that we began to see it starting with Ronald Reagan.
I would answer that in a couple of ways. One is that there was still bipartisanship. There was still compromise. There was still discussion between Democrats and Republicans. And as a result, you got much more moderate appointees. We hadn't gotten to the divisions that we are now facing. You didn't get to the point where such extremes governed. So that's one of the issues. I mean, think about just even the chief justices or the justices that Nixon appointed. It doesn't reflect the far right that is now before us. Nothing compares to what's going on now. Back during that time, I think you had 3 networks. They all had the same facts. So we debated what the difference of implementation was. What should we do about the problems? But we all agreed on what the problems were, what the facts about those problems were. We don't anymore, and that's causing part of this problem. And then President Trump unleashed the power of people to say things that would have been considered completely impossible to say out loud. Now they're quite normalized. And so it's easy to say that you want to lock her up. It's easy to say a lot of things that we would have never said before. So I think when you put all those together, you end up in a situation where Mitch McConnell feels perfectly safe in saying, we can't have Merrick Garland. And on the point that you raised about Merrick Garland, I just want to say, Michelle, I think you're right that maybe a female would have, but I think anybody who was actually more liberal than Merrick Garland might have revved up the base. Merrick Garland was sort of one of those people that was so middle of the road, so totally acceptable, should have been acceptable to Republicans and Democrats, that I don't think Democrats got as excited about. And also remember, we thought for sure that Hillary was going to be the president. And so we'd get the next appointee under President Hillary Clinton. So I think there are a lot of explanations for what went wrong back then.
Judge Hackett, Glenda, I'd like to ask you, as someone who sat on the state courts, what impact has the appointments to federal judiciary had over the years? What did you see when you were on the court? What are you observing now as someone who has been part of the judiciary? Are you seeing decisions being overruled? Are you seeing an impact in the type of decisions that are being overruled? You're on mute.
My apologies. I couldn't agree more with what Michelle and Jill have said. And what we're seeing, though, is that it has been kind of this under the radar changes that we've seen while we were busy, and rightfully so, paying attention to all the shenanigans with Trump. He is such one for distractions. And we were paying attention to impeachment and all the things that were happening, all these appointments were being made. And what we're seeing historically is just an erosion. We talk about voter rights as we are really gearing up for this election now and how serious that is. But the erosion didn't just start with where we are now. It has been a steady decline since the case back into 2013 with Shelby versus Holder. And then you couple that with a new administration, with a Jeff Sessions who wasn't at all concerned about what that meant. And so the implications are far reaching. And it is at a state level one way and difficult, but also when you go up the chain of what is happening. And we see a great example the last few weeks of Houston and that county there and Harris County, because all three of those appellate judges are Trump appointees on the Fifth Circuit. And so as we talk about what is happening and how the courts are changing, I think we're going to see a further erosion of things that really affect us, to the point that Jill was making earlier, that, I mean, the whole spectrum. And we're talking about a shift that could happen and is already happening and will continue to have serious implications for decades, Let us also remember that on the appellate court, federal appellate court level, that 85% of those are now seated, not just nominated, but have been confirmed, are white men. And to Michelle's point earlier, I mean, there's not one Black judge in that group. And so I think we're in real trouble. And I think we're going to continue to see the impact as it ripples up and down the system.
Well, let's stay on that thread for a moment. Michelle, if you want to pick up on that, what rights and freedoms have we already seen suffer the most, and what are the worst restrictions that we can anticipate?
So one of the challenges is for people to understand that more is at stake. The Supreme Court. Of course, Supreme Court is huge, right? So as we think about major cases, from voting rights to criminal justice to reproductive health and rights, the environment, this summer, LGBTQ rights, DACA, so many big cases before the Supreme Court, and what we saw is Chief Justice John Roberts coming out to define the court in a way that we hadn't seen from him before. And I think that what we saw this summer from the Chief Justice was an effort to steer the court along the way of rule of law. We saw that certainly in the abortion case. For the first time, he voted with the liberals on the court, speaking to precedential value in June Medical v. Rousseau. Although I would say this case did not make him a liberal, and none of the decisions in which he voted with the liberals this summer makes him a liberal at all. But I think it's really important to think about the statement that he made during this Trump administration. It's something that we've not had to hear from a Chief Justice in a very long time, which is that there's no ownership of the court by a president. There is no such thing as a Trump judge. There's no such thing as an Obama judge. There's no such thing as a Clinton judge. I think there is a reason why he spoke in that way. And that is because of the attacks on the judiciary by the president in such a way that could lead people to think that the court is a legislative branch of government, and it's not. And that is a real concern. There's one thing to have ideological differences, which we've always had on the court, clearly. It's another thing when the court is seen as a partisan branch of government. And that is exactly what we don't want to see of our courts. So I'll end it there, but with so much more to say on this point.
Jill, do you want to pick up on that?
Well,
I guess many people are wondering, Roberts has talked about keeping, or people are hoping that he's going to keep the Supreme Court above the politics. But certainly in his ruling on the precedent of the Louisiana case and abortion case, on one hand, he ruled on precedent. On the other, he gave wide latitude to interpret what an undue burden is. And therefore, he basically opened the door for reproductive rights restrictions in so many other states. So he verbalizes on one hand, but then his actions are another.
And can I say just one thing before Jill steps in there, which is that we saw that across a series of cases this summer that were perceived as liberal victories. I think one of the strategies that we can see from the Supreme Court is the ratcheting up and the weaponizing of the First Amendment, specifically religious protections, as being the key to unlock the door with regard to discrimination. If there's one specter under which one can discriminate, it will be you can use the threat that your religious liberty has somehow been harmed or would be harmed if a particular law were to be put in place, or if certain freedoms were to be given to certain communities. And so I think that that's a really good point that you make, and it's not just in June Medical where we saw that.
Right, right.
I think before I answer your question, based on what Michelle said, I just have to point out, when you mentioned the First Amendment, it's the amendment that Amy Coney Barrett could not list what it included. She could include, you remember, she included the establishment of religion, freedom of religion, and then she started failing. And the one she couldn't get at all was the right to petition the government, the right to assemble and petition. And then that takes us, in my mind, to, for example, Attorney General Barr ordering troops into Lafayette Square and the use of chemicals against legitimate, peaceful protesters. That's a big challenge to democracy, and it's something that I don't think we're paying enough attention to. It's not just choice. It's not just gay marriage. It's not just LGBTQ rights in general. It is very fundamental freedom of speech, freedom of petition, freedom to speak out. So we need to be really careful when we think about who's getting appointed to the courts. And I want to mention also, before I answer about Roberts, that it's making the state courts and the down ballot races much more important when you vote this year. And I got to vote yesterday. Was the first day of early voting in Illinois, or in Chicago area. I voted yesterday, it took me a very long time for only one thing, and that was there's a
Good.
referendum and the judicial ballot. And I check multiple sources before I vote to retain a judge. I mean, I personally find it offensive that we vote for judges. Sorry about that. I just think that's not the way to go. But since it is the way we go, I want to make sure that I have a say. I checked with friends who are judges as to, what do they think of certain people, retired judges, because I wouldn't ask a current judge. But take the time to do it, because as the Supreme Court starts saying federal laws are unconstitutional, it's going to be up to the states to pass legislation, which means you need to have a legislature in your state that reflects your views, whatever they happen to be, and you need the courts there to protect you.
Correct.
So please pay attention to the judges on your local ballots and to your state senators and your state congresspeople. So please pay attention to that. As to Roberts, we have depended on him quite a lot and look to him as an institutionalist who wants to keep the credibility of the court intact. And that may be influencing him, but when it gets to be a 6-3, very conservative majority, I mean, he is a conservative, and how easy it would be for him to slide from being in the center to being with all the others. And I want you to pay attention to the ages of the people who are appointed. Those judges are going to, the new conservative judges are young.
Generations.
It's going to affect not just the rest of my life, but it's going to maybe next 30 or 40 years.
Right.
And that, of course, raises the question of court packing. And I have been on the fence about court packing, but I was on a panel with Erwin Chemerinsky, thank you, who was fabulous. I had never heard him speak before.
He's a good colleague.
Totally terrific. Tell him I loved him.
I will.
It was a Hollywood panel that we were on, so I was like blown away. Billy Ray was on it, and it was a terrific panel. But he basically said, look, yeah, the consequence of packing the court, of adding 2 more seats to make up for the stolen seats, the consequence is that if the Republicans take the White House and the Senate again, they can add 2 more. But the consequence of not doing it is that they control the court for the next 30, 40 years or more. And with a very far right court that does not reflect the majority of Americans' views. So we are now at a point of minority rule in this country. And that kind of made me think, well, maybe we have to go with 2 more justices to make up for the hypocrisy. And it wasn't just Mitch McConnell. It wasn't just Lindsey Graham. It was also the candidate herself. Amy Coney Barrett said, you can't appoint in an election year when it will change the direction of the court. That isn't the law. That isn't the rule. The rule is that you're president for 4 years and you can do that until the day of the inauguration at noon. But because Amy Coney Barrett and Mitch McConnell and everybody else said, oh, you can't in the last year, that's how they got unfair advantage. And,
Well, the
we need to
rules
take
are
that into account.
constantly changing. They're
Yes.
changing the rules to suit their own needs. They, with Merrick Garland, it was one set of rules, and then because they are now in the majority, in a different position, they changed the rules. Glenda, I'd like to bring you in on this and also stay with the same topic here. How radical, assuming that Amy, Barrett's confirmation goes as they plan it,
Yes.
lest the Democrats have the leverage of some sort of quorum issues. And there are some Republicans who at the last minute change their mind. If her confirmation.
We need a McCain thumbs down situation, or, just something that happens to change this. I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
But how radical will this new majority be? Will it really act out of step with the public?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole game plan. And for us to even think that that was not a consideration when she was nominated, when Judge Barrett was nominated, is really naive. They have intentionally done this. And what we as a country looked at the Kavanaugh confirmation, but let us not forget that there was a confirmation before that. So this will be the third Supreme Court justice to be on this bench. And it will radically change everything fundamentally, from voting rights to women's rights, all the way down. And so I think that this has been a part of their appeal to their base. And that was what Trump promised. And that's what McConnell is delivering. And Barr, don't get me started about how despicable he has been in that position as an attorney general. He has not acted in the interest of the people. He has acted in the interest of Trump every step of the way. And so I think that we are in for a very tough time. Jill, I appreciate what you were just saying and sharing, because I have really been struggling with that too. But I think that these are some extreme times that will demand some extreme actions to try to at least level the playing field some, because there were so many situations where we have been disadvantaged. But at the end of the day, if Democrats, to the earlier points, had really expressed how important it was, Hillary talked about it some, but the fact that we had such an old bench on the Supreme Court, it was likely that there were going to be vacancies. I mean, one we didn't expect because of the situation of how he died, but this is really such, it will go long beyond this election cycle. And to your point, I mean, decades and decades of implications. And so I think that this is by design. I think it appeals to a very, very conservative base that Trump has been relying on. But I don't think that coalition will survive in this November election, but the Supreme Court bench will. And that's the problem.
I think it's also important. I love this conversation, and it's so important. There's been a different kind of philosophy between Democrats and Republicans, and the Republicans have, in fact, finely tuned, with a fine-tuned comb, just what we see today. But you think about Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is well underappreciated in terms of diversifying the bench and with women. He was the president that nominated Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to be Judge Ginsburg on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. She was actually not the first woman that he put on that court. He actually introduced the first women for 6 different circuit courts of appeal where they never had been before. More than a century of those benches, never, 2nd, 3rd, DC, 10th, 11th, he put them there. And the courts expanded under Jimmy Carter. And in his diaries and in talks with others, he actually was quite deliberative. He was a bit cautious. He didn't think that all of this power should be concentrated for him alone. And so it wasn't about a power grab, but what's good for our nation. And it's very different. And thinking about what has taken place in recent years during the Obama administration with the blocks by Mitch McConnell, and then what's taken place during the last 4 years of the Trump administration, night and day in terms of thinking about the court. Strategically, I think that Jill's point is spot on, right? The failure, even with the very recent Democratic National Convention, to make the courts front and center, not just the Supreme Court, but the lower courts. I mean, let's face it, like the Supreme Court handles only a very tiny slice of the kinds of issues that matter to the lives of Americans. It's the lower courts that address those issues, the federal district court, and then the circuit courts of appeal. And that last bit will be the Supreme Court. So thinking about these issues beyond just those few is critically important.
And Michelle, I would add to that too, that President Carter, of course, has a special place in my heart because I'm a Georgian, but he appointed so many Black judges in addition to women. And in fact, I clerked for the first Black federal judge that was appointed in the Deep South, Horace Ward. And it's just, if you look at those numbers and you look at what happened, I cannot agree with you more in terms of diversity, both with women and with Black judges. on
And
that.
Black women.
Yes, and Black women, absolutely. I had to share this 20 seconds with you, that the judge that he appointed, Horace T. Ward, was actually the first litigant to try to integrate the University of Georgia Law School. And it didn't happen. And it went on and on. And then he went to law school elsewhere. Obviously, he didn't get in. And he came back and he was sworn in the same courtroom where he had been denied decades ago admission into. And I mean, I can't tell you what that, and you know, me being a young law clerk and being with, you know, it was just this affirmation that there is still hope, that we see such a difference now in attitudes and how we're approaching these things, that troubled me deeply. But it also really ignites a certain kind of extra drive that we cannot continue along this road. Now, I'm not sure where we end up on it, but I do know what will happen if we fail to vote this November, and if we fail to keep an eye. To Jill's point, very quickly, in Georgia, in fact, a part of this new political action committee, and it's called Georgia Blue Project. And what we're doing, our strategy is from the bottom up of local elections and trying to flip the state legislature, because so many people forget that the census is going to be used in the 2021 legislative session to then do this whole bit of how do we redistrict? How do we draw these lines? And that has such impact. And of course, all the kinds of things that we're talking about in terms of judges being appointed on state court benches. How does that happen? That's nominated by the governor. Who's the governor? Stacey Abrams lost by 50,000 votes a couple of years ago because the Kemp was the Secretary of State, and there had been over 300,000 voters who were dropped from the rolls and never received notice. And so the fight is not just this election for the judiciary and the future of this country. It has got to be from all the time, not just gearing up for presidential elections. And we've got to be very intentional about this going forward. We just have to.
Well, I think that
Can I add just one more thing about, since we're talking about President Carter, and it was he who appointed me as General Counsel of the Army, and many women to first-time female roles. He really, really believed in it. Sarah Weddington, the lawyer in the Roe case, was one of those women in the White House. It was a fabulous group of women, who many of whom became judges afterwards, but we had what was called the Old Girls Network of all the women who he had appointed. And he really did a lot to bring diversity at both gender and racially. So we should all be very grateful to him. He started a trend that was followed certainly by Clinton and many others. So we need to give him credit that he, as you said, he's an underrated president who really
is.
And if I could add one last of the shout out for Carter, because I think it's so important, right? I mean, he really broke through that glass ceiling at that time. Yes. Right, like today to see that number, which we don't even see it in 2020 with Trump, but to do that when he was in office was astounding, and also where they came from, right? So you think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg; she's coming from the ACLU, the Women's Rights Project, right? It's not that she's been at some big firm for a number of years or something, and he says that yes, this is what being qualified means: someone who's been fighting on the behalf of civil rights and women's rights at the ACLU. She is a person who should be on the federal bench. That says a lot.
So it says a lot. He showed up, he came to my office, and I thought it was a joke. They said, we've got to do this sweep. President Carter wants to come over and see you. He was no longer president at that time. And he came up and said, I just want to understand what you do here. He sincerely believed in the goodness of people and that whole concept of a beloved community. And he wanted the federal judiciary to look like America. And that's what he set out to do. And I could not agree more. I mean, we owe him such a debt of gratitude. But look at what has happened in terms of the erosion. Not only are we getting people on the bench that are just really out of step with the country, but we're getting people where the American Bar Association says are not qualified.
Right.
And it
Right.
still goes through. But until we get some handle on this, until we have some balance, until I frankly think we have to flip the Senate, I think we're going to see more of this.
And
Well,
I
and
just
I
have
think
to
it's
point out to
important.
people who are, follow my pins. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm wearing a Ruth Bader Ginsburg pin. A
Oh
Ruth
no,
Bader
wait, I got
Ginsburg
something
dissent
better than that.
collar
Oh,
and
I've got
Ruth Bader
something better
Ginsburg
than that.
dissent collar earrings. So I'm all Ruth Bader Ginsburg today.
Everybody,
No,
look
wait,
at
wait, I
Glenda.
got you, Jill. I got you. Can you see mine?
Oh, good.
Vote
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
tell them Art Justice RBG.
Okay, so I have on a vote necklace.
Okay, all right.
Underneath my Ruth Bader
I couldn't
Ginsburg is
resist.
vote.
I had to. Michelle has seen this shirt several times, but I had to show you my shirt.
And I have asked for one, and she
And you're getting one.
has
My
one
niece
being
specially
FedExed to me.
designed this for me. And it's
These are
on.
fabulous, fabulous. All right. Jill's pins, everybody knows, but Glenda's t-shirt, that's a whole new trend now. I'd like to go back, though, to the significant point, and that ties in to our topic tonight, which is your vote in the courts.
Yeah.
Everything, as the panelists have discussed already, everything is local, local, local. And the Democrats, progressives in this country dropped the ball after the 70s. We thought we had attained the civil rights, we had attained women's rights, we had attained reproductive rights, and we did not see the strategizing that was going on beginning at the local level with school board races, with state legislatures, with grooming candidates to move all the way up the legislative ladder to Congress. And I think the first time it really blindsided everybody was in the backlash against President Obama with the emergence of the Tea Party in 2010. And that's when it was gloves are off. I mean, at that point is when they decided to really mobilize and take hold here. So your vote has bearing on every right and every freedom that is outlined in the Constitution, because we are now facing a court, a Supreme Court, and at least a third of the federal appellate judiciary that is moving to undo so much of that. So the question that some people have had, and a question that actually came in from somebody in advance of this, is, so what do we as citizens, aside from voting for candidates that we feel will promote access to defend these rights, what do we as citizens do about the number of federal judges that have been appointed? Is there a way to hold them accountable? Is there a way to impeach them? Can an evaluation commission be appointed to look at particularly the appointees that, as we've stressed before, the Bar Association deemed unqualified? Is there some recourse? Or do we have to watch these courts undo everything for 2 more generations?
Unfortunately, impeachment requires that it be something that they did either in getting confirmed, and there is some evidence that, for example, Amy Coney Barrett may have committed perjury in her confirmation hearings. So that's an impeachable offense. But otherwise, it has to be something you do on the bench or in the course of your work. So impeachment is probably not going to solve our problem. Democrats have to pay attention. We keep saying this, but I want to say it again. At the state level as well, both in terms of making sure that we have a Republican or a Democratic representation in the federal level and in the state level. The state level will affect redistricting, And the Republicans have been very systematic and persistent in making sure that they have the governor and the legislature at the state level so that they can redistrict for their own benefit. That's something we haven't done and will hurt us dramatically as we go forward. But there's also the Electoral College. And that's an issue that we haven't talked about, aside from the fact that it shouldn't be. It has no purpose in modern life. It is what it is, and to get rid of it requires a constitutional amendment, which the small states that benefit from would have to vote for, and they're not going to vote for it. And if there should be a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to 1 vote per state. And right now there are 26 states that would go Republican.
Right.
And that's because they've been very systematic and careful, and we haven't been. So when we talk about your vote matters, it's the court of the Electoral College, as well as the Supreme Court, as well as the state courts. So please pay attention and don't stop voting after you voted for president and or maybe your senator at the federal level. You have to go much further than that.
No, you have to pay attention down ballot. Michelle, you've been waiting I saw you nodding that you wanted to say
Well,
something.
you started off with a question about impeachment, and just as Jill was saying, you need impeachable offenses. The fact that someone doesn't, support clean air, or thinks that there must be a much more rigorous standard in order to support racial equality, or the fact that they might believe that religious freedom trumps LGBTQ rights, those are not impeachable offenses. The court has been, we've been very slow to monitor and enforce at the court level. There have been judges since the Me Too movement began who have resigned quietly because there have been issues that have raised about their comportment with regard to sex, sexual harassment, behavior. That's something that we've really not seen before. We could possibly see more of that, but that's quite different than just ideology or partisanship on the bench. But to the point about what can people do, we've talked about voting, and that's really important. It's also important to think about the strategizing that has been full form for people who would otherwise seek to deny other people rights, and that is that they use their state legislatures. They've historically done that, even in the wake of the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment on one hand abolishes slavery, but it was the Southern senators that said, but let's just add this little piece in there, except if convicted of a crime. And I think that the Northerners, the abolitionists, really had no idea about what was going to happen next. But it's very informative for us, which is that before ratification, they went back home and they created all sorts of laws, right? All sorts. A crime for a Black person to sell corn, crime if you sell wheat, crime to stand on a corner, crime if you're caught in town more than 5 days. And he could say, well, here's just pay the fine. And as long as you can pay the fine, you're fine. But imagine a $50, $100, $175 fine in 1865, 1866 for a Black person to be able to pay. This is how we got the re-entrenchment of slavery leading into Jim Crow in the United States. But imagine being active at the state level. Give you an example. In the state of California, reproductive privacy rights and autonomy is baked into state law, state constitution, both legislatively and in the Constitution. We've seen New York do this. We've now seen Illinois do this. I think one of the ways to get us out of this time and protect civil liberties and civil rights will be for more active engagement at the local legislative level. If the Supreme Court won't protect these rights, then states can have it in their own constitution and also with legislation to protect those rights.
And it also matters, I think, too, who is in the Secretary of State's office. I mean, that was just such a painful lesson. And a couple of years ago with Stacey Abrams running for governor, that so much of what happens with the election guidelines and polling places and what happens and why are there these long lines in minority communities and not in the suburbs. And so I think that as we're talking about this, I can't stress enough the need to go back and talk about how it's got to just not stop at the top of the ballot. But we really have to look at, and even with the whole criminal justice reform issues going on in this country, you know, who's the DA? Who's making the decisions about indictments? And people ask me about that all the time. Who appoints the police chiefs? You know, how are the sheriffs elected? And we are not paying enough attention to that,
In the way
nor are
we
we
feel it.
nor are we holding people accountable. We don't, once they're elected, it shouldn't stop then. Where is the accountability? Do you just show up at a town hall meeting when it's time for you to be reelected every 4? I mean, it just does not make sense. And so there has got to be such a radical, in my mind, a radical transformation of how we look at this and how we make our priorities. And to Jill's and Michelle's points earlier, you know, there's got to be a strategy. We can't always be in a position of reacting. What will be the strategy so that we are being proactive? A lot of these issues is what I think we have to do.
Well, and that's what has been a chief concern, that the more progressive, even more moderate parts of the country have not strategized to counter this. I mean, we began to see what was happening going back with the judiciary, going back to the Bork nomination. And we began to see the politicizing of the court. Does somebody want to just address that? I mean, it's interesting to think about that in the context of the hearings that many of us watched last week. I mean, what is the point of the hearings when you have the judicial candidate not answer any questions?
Well, that's a terrific point, because in both the candidates' writings and on video, we saw inconsistencies. So a video that's been well circulated on social media is with Judge Amy Coney Barrett saying that judges should not go through a nomination and confirmation process immediately preceding an election. We also see in her writing that, of course, nominees should address hypotheticals that are presented by members of the Senate. And we saw inconsistency with that during this very process. So those are very fair questions that you're asking. And of course, we have to think about how people trust the judiciary. There's a reason why these are lifetime appointments. Now, that's not written into stone in the Constitution. It's something that's evolved over time. But part of the reason for that is the understanding that these are not people who are owned by a particular president, but that they can act independently and with good judgment and comportment. That's critically important. And what you've been suggesting by your question, Sylvia, is that we've seen something very different over the last 4 years, including individuals who are deemed to be not qualified by the American Bar Association as it has evaluated these candidates. And it's not been just the American Bar Association. For some of these candidates, there are commissions in their own home states that have said, no, these are people who are actually not fit to serve on a court and wouldn't have been fit to serve on a state court in our state. And those have been with bipartisan, nonpartisan groups who have no particular dog in the fight except the integrity of the court as mattering.
Mhm.
I think we have another Amy who made a point that's relevant to your question, Sylvia, which is that was Senator Amy Klobuchar, who said there are tracks.
Right.
So even though Amy Coney Barrett adopted the position that all recent Supreme Court nominees have taken, which is to not answer, quote, hypotheticals that aren't actually hypothetical, we didn't need to have her answers because she has written voluminously. She has given speeches, and we know exactly where she will come out on all of these issues, both in terms of how she would interpret the law through the originalist point of view, which I am no expert on, but will point out that the founders did not perceive that there would be that attitude. They wrote a very vague constitution with the thought in mind that modern inventions would happen that wouldn't be covered by what they thought. And they wanted to be sure that the courts could use fundamental principles, but not be bound by what they, as founders of the country, knew or thought. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well.
That's the reason we have a Ninth Amendment. And they were not wedded to an originalist, textualist point of view. This is actually something that we saw trotted out actually by Bork himself. So this itself is actually of a kind of modern iteration, something that has been developed to really in some ways be outcome determinative. It's interesting in the Bostock case, which was the case that struck down, it's the case that liberalized LGBTQ rights. It said that gay, lesbian, trans individuals cannot be discriminated against in the workplace. But what's very interesting is that you have several conservatives on the court reaching very different conclusions, all saying that they're relying on originalism and textualism, which shows you how absolutely fluid it is and how it can be whatever one decides that it actually happens to be.
Or whether it fits your perception of the right outcome. Because I think no matter how much they say they're bound by the text, not so much if it's not the result they want.
Yeah, they get very creative about it and justify it. They do. I mean, that's what's happening.
So what I'd like to do at this point is we have a number of questions in the queue here, and address some of them. One of them is that CNN just reported voters have been receiving emails saying vote for Trump or else. To what authority should this be reported?
Getting emails from
Anonymous, they don't know. This is a question someone said, to what authority should this kind of email be reported?
Well, the Secretary of States are the ones that oversee the state's elections, and so that would seem to be a logical place. The concern has been the capturing of that space. We saw that in the Georgia election. We've seen that in Florida and elsewhere, but that would be the logical place to begin with. And what we hope, right, is that a vibrant democracy then results in individuals who want to uphold that democracy. And it's not about party, but actually responding to people in order to make sure that their opportunity to vote in a fair and free election takes place unencumbered.
So as a criminal prosecutor, I would also see this slightly differently, which is I'd go right to law enforcement, because I can't cite the statute, but there is a statute that makes it illegal to threaten a voter. And so that's a clear threat. Vote or else for this particular candidate is clearly a threat that one probably shouldn't take seriously. I can't believe that there's anyone really behind that. But on the other hand, if I got that email, I'd be taking it seriously. So I would probably go to law enforcement. And unfortunately, depending on what state and city you're in, law enforcement's going to say, who cares? We want them to win. So
exactly to that point, Jill, you know, recognize that today was it a Florida officer who in uniform with a Trump mask on?
Yes.
And, you know, as we've seen in recent years, some of the biggest threats to the United States happen to be domestic terrorism through white nationalist organizations. And what we've also seen is that those organizations have infiltrated law enforcement. So I agree that the definitely pivoting to criminal law investigation and all of that, but it's also deep worrying and worrisome that we've seen within the specter of law enforcement, those being used to actually suppress individuals' rights and freedoms to vote.
Right. And then we also had a situation recently where employees have said that if they don't vote for Trump, they won't have a job. And so there's this intimidation factor on so many different angles here. And so you are depending on your paycheck and you're afraid to say anything to anybody. So what do you do in that situation? I mean, the tactics are so blatant. They just really are blatant. We had literally today in Georgia, a voting ballot drop-off box that was set on fire. I mean, how outrageous is that? That was reported earlier this afternoon on the news. And so the intimidation of, and then you wonder, well, what happened to those ballots that were deposited there and what's happening and why do we have fake ones in California, Michelle? the GOP basically has said
Right.
we're putting there. And so, but to Jill's point too, the question is, if people report and go to law enforcement, it's really a toss-up, to your point, as to whether there's going to be anything done. And might there be some retaliation from that part of the system for even having raised that? And so we've got a lot of problems in a lot of different areas. We do.
Well,
I
there
don't want
are,
people to go away scared from this, but remember, this comes from the top. You have, on the day that indictments are announced against 13 individuals in Michigan, domestic terrorism against the
Right.
governor. You have the
Right.
President of the United States attacking the governor and supporting them. And this is continued. He continues to say, well, lock her up, liberate Michigan. He is encouraging the attack by domestic terrorists on the governor of Michigan. So these are things that are serious threats to democracy. This goes beyond just the courts. It goes
It
to the
does.
very fundamentals of our very existence as a democracy.
but I would
Yeah,
like
and I
to
mean, he made
point
that
out,
clear in the debate. I'll just tell him to
Right.
stand down.
Yeah.
And even before these elections, a couple of years ago, remember he said, if I don't win, my supporters will take to the streets.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of signal is it sending that we're going to somehow have a civil war? I'm not going to leave the White House voluntarily. This is not democracy. And the rule of law means nothing to this administration, just means nothing.
I would like to point out though, to this point, Michelle is correct. The Secretary of State's office and the election commissioners in the county records offices are the front lines where this should be reported. There are also, if somebody goes online, Googles, there are election protection hotline numbers across the country, and there are offices in most major cities, if not all states, and you can report incidents there. So let me get to
Now,
another
of course, keep in
question.
mind, no one knows how you vote. Voting is still secret. So even though
Yes.
you get a threat, vote for Trump or else,
Right.
no one's going to know how you voted. You should not
That's
be
right.
intimidated by that.
Is the question we have, isn't the issue of abortion and Roe v. Wade the primary motivation? I know it certainly was. Is it still, it was the primary motivation for stacking the court. Now that they do or will have a majority, do you think it will remain the dominant issue?
Well, I think the dominant issue right now for President Trump is who's going to decide the election, which of course is the American people who vote and should vote in numbers large enough that there is no question that goes to any court. But that's the thing that's on his mind in trying to push through a ninth justice for the Supreme Court.
So I think historically it was a perfect storm in many ways for Republicans to organize around. Let's go back to the 1970s, 1973, Roe v. Wade's a 7-2 opinion. 5 of the justices on that winning side for Roe are Republican appointed, with Justice Blackmun being nominated to the court by Richard Nixon. Then let's think about George H.W. Bush in Congress, shepherding through Title X, which provided reproductive health care for the poorest of Americans, signed into law by Richard Nixon. When asked about this, he said, this is basic common sense. This is basic public health. That was also the response of George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, treasurer, what organization? Planned Parenthood. What we've seen today is very different than that Republican legacy. And so the questioners, the question that's been raised by a member of the audience, how much of this has to do with Roe v. Wade, was very interesting because the evangelicals have been a significant part of this playbook. And
Yeah.
tilting to them has been a significant strategy in terms of building a power base. And it's been an interesting thing because it intersects both law and also science and health. As this conversation started off, we were talking about facts aren't shared anymore. It used to be a common set of facts and people could disagree, but this was an area in which facts could shift. And we see that today. So many people think that, well, abortions are really unsafe. They're so unsafe that you need all these measures in place. Well, in the United States, a person is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. Abortion is as safe as a penicillin shot. We know this from the World Health Organization. But here's a space in which people have been able to veer off in a land of no facts, and it's been quite influential for people. So that there are people who are even what might be called pro-choice or pro-reproductive health rights and justice, who are actually a little bit confused about these issues because the movement has been able to take foot in such a way as to really galvanize the messaging. And they've been really quite influential on this point. I would say today it's not just about that, right? I mean, we see that in the anti-immigration, that's kind of come up with this. We see it also in the voter suppression. So the same people between 2010
And in COVID, in the White House
COVID,
response
right?
to COVID.
Absolutely. So where abortion rights served as a kind of platform to move along evangelicals successfully, it's now been able to spread in terms of other things. And I'll just close with this point. Between 2010 and 2013, we saw more anti-contraception, more anti-abortion legislation proposed and enacted than we saw in the 30 years prior combined. But it's also important to know that in that same period, we saw dramatic anti-immigration battles as well in state houses. And we also saw, in addition to that, dramatic efforts to suppress voting. So the important thing there is the intersecting quality of these issues. The same people who don't care about reproductive health rights and justice don't care about your right to vote either, don't care about the environment, and would support kids being locked away in cages.
This
Another
lack of facts and the lack of or taking control of the message goes back a long time before this. It goes back certainly to the 70s and the Equal Rights Amendment, where you had Phyllis Schlafly taking control of a message that made people believe things that were absolutely not true. And that was still in a time when we had only 3 networks and they all had the same facts. But still, there was Phyllis Schlafly, who may be sort of the precursor of Fox News in convincing a certain group of people that things were true that have no basis in reality.
Another question we have is, under what circumstances can we add judges?
Well, there's been fluidity. I'll leave that to you, Judge Hatchett.
No, I was just going to say that it's interesting because there's no set number
Right.
of how many justices can be appointed to the Supreme Court. And so that's what's been the interesting kind of debate and dialogue as to what if, and hopefully Biden will win, if he will be willing to increase the votes, the number of justices there. But there's no number. I mean, that just has never been defined. And so it'll be very interesting to see what happens and whether there is a move, particularly if there's a control of the Senate, to add more justices to the Senate, to the Supreme Court.
And the same is true at the federal district court level as well. You can create new district courts and add judges to it depending on the caseload of the court. So there is no set number that's statutorily or constitutionally mandated.
Another question we have, this is asking for you to opine a bit. Do you think Amy Coney Barrett will strike down the Affordable Care Act, or will she just whittle it down piece by piece? And what is the implication for Medicare?
So let me say this, there's a lot that's at stake with the Affordable Care Act. And it is asking that we pivot into a land that we don't exactly know what she might do Although what we can see is that with the exception of Chief Justice John Roberts, the conservatives on the court would have voted to strike down the law altogether. What's at
Right.
stake right now happens to be something that can actually be separated out from the law right now because there is no fee penalty. Congress has gotten rid of that fee penalty in the law, and so it can be severed from the law. If the case comes before the Supreme Court, that is the possibility of what we might see. But I think it's important to understand what's just at stake, because Americans have been able to live for the last 10 years without having to worry about pre-existing conditions. They've been able to have their kids on their health insurance programs until the age of 26. They've been able to have a series of mandated coverage that just wasn't there before, ranging from mental health coverage to issues involving reproductive health and Medicare and Medicaid. So there's a lot that happens to be at stake right now with the Affordable Care Act coming before the US Supreme Court.
And I don't know why it was such a lightning rod in this whole piece with Trump. Why he was so determined to dismantle this whole Affordable Care Act. If this happens, and I think it is very likely to your question, Kovia, that it will be not just piece by piece. I think it will just absolutely be wiped out. And at that point, we're talking about more than 20 million Americans who will instantly not have that coverage, not to mention the dependents up to 26 that Michelle is just talking about. And how do you define pre-existing conditions? There's been some conversation, perhaps, if you had COVID and now you show the antibodies, that maybe then that was a pre-existing
Right.
condition. It is, the implications are so dramatic about what this could do. And I think that that really is a part of the agenda. And I do think that those were part of the conversations when they made the decision of who they were going to nominate. I think they had to nominate a woman just because of the tenor of the times. But I think that they particularly chose this woman because I do believe that she is going to support their agenda. And I think that's exactly what McConnell promised, and that's what they're doing.
But I think to go to the question that was asked by the audience member, you can never predict how a judge will rule in any particular case. And that many of the people who, as you've pointed out, Cynthia, many of the Republican appointees to the court voted for Roe. And you can't always tell who's going to end up being liberal and who's going to end up turning out to be conservative. There are a lot of examples. Justice Warren would be one, the Warren Court. Not expected that he would end up where he was. So we can't tell, but I would say Amy Coney Barrett may be an exception to my saying that because her writings are so extensive. She has spoken so openly that it would be hard for me to imagine that she would abandon everything she has said and thought. That's where the problem comes in.
And I think this is a whole different time that we're living in. I mean, we've just not seen this before. And I agree, Jill, I can't imagine that she will make a big departure from where she has been. And I think that that's exactly why she was appointed. I do, I nominated.
So vote with that in mind.
Yes.
Another question that's interesting, and this is federal judges, quote, hold their offices during good behavior, close quote, and are subject to impeachment when not on good behavior. What would constitute, quote, not good behavior?
Taking a bribe would be an example.
Sexual misconduct.
I was going to say Jeffrey Toobin, if he were on the court, would be certainly guilty of that behavior, but maybe that's not appropriate to mention here. It would take serious things. We don't impeach judges lightly. It takes a serious abuse of either their power in office or criminality that's unrelated to their office.
Here's an interesting question. Possibly start with Jill since she was in the Justice Department. What do you think about the Attorney General intervening in the Jean Carroll case? Do you think there's any hope that that will be struck down?
Yes, and it's interesting because that you raise that, because there is a recent decision which I would normally be talking against, but it's one that could lead to the court saying that you cannot allow an argument that Donald Trump was acting within the scope of his office when he defamed E. Jean Carroll. And I'm trying to remember, does anybody remember the exact case? It was this week, what the circumstances were where, oh, I know what it was. It was the police, a guard in a prison raped a female prisoner repeatedly and claimed that it was within the scope of his job. And the court basically said, under no definition could it be argued that this was within the scope of his job. And so they freed the state from paying penalties because he was acting outside the scope of his job. But so that's why I say I would normally be outraged at the decision, but it does give me hope that then the court would have to say, well, it's certainly not within Donald Trump's scope of his job to have raped someone or to defend against that rape in the way that he is doing. So maybe there's something coming out of that court decision that
Actually, that was a decision involving the guard. That was a decision that Amy Coney Barrett had made.
Right, exactly, Seventh Circuit.
And when she was on the appellate court,
right.
and the survivor in that case, the woman who had been in prison, sued the prison because a guard had raped her. And Amy Coney Barrett decided that the prison was not liable because it was not within his official duties. There's another.
Nothing to mention about he had control over the prisoner. I mean,
right, exactly.
Right.
It's not like she.
One piece to that too, which is the dereliction of responsibility that we see with the Attorney General pivoting in for the president, an individual who's to serve the people of our nation and is not to be the personal attorney for the United States president. Now, people can intellectually debate that point, but we see a significant shift. One of the things that we've seen in the confirmation hearings of attorney generals, and we certainly saw this during the Obama administration, was making sure, senators wanted to make sure that the AGs understood their role was not in carrying water for the president, but it was in fact for the people of the United States. And we just simply don't see that at this particular time. And that's a nonpartisan issue.
If you go back to the Saturday Night Massacre, which was yesterday was the 47th anniversary of that event.
Was it?
Yeah, 47 years ago on October 20th was the Saturday Night Massacre. And it's the same thing there, where the Attorney General basically said, I made a promise to Congress that I would not fire the special prosecutor unless there was cause, and there is no cause, so I'm not carrying out your orders. It's the same sort of logic. And we need to go back to a time when the Attorney General represents the United States of America and the people of America. I used to be proud as a Department of Justice prosecutor to go into court and say, I'm here on behalf of the people of the United States. Right. I don't think people in the Department of Justice, those that I still know there, feel that pride. And you've seen a lot of longtime career prosecutors leaving because of the pressure to do political actions.
Here's an interesting, I'm going to combine two questions here. Isn't it better to call it court balancing, which is more positive, than calling it court packing?
Yeah.
And in line with that, in the court packing argument, can't we use the fact that our population has grown, and for that reason alone, it's okay to add more judges to mirror the demographics?
I would answer that one on the first part of the question, words matter, terminology matters, and I had started on Twitter something called "Say This, Not That" to start using the right words. And I would say court balancing sounds pretty good compared to court packing. But as far as the population growing, if you have 11 people sitting at the same time on one case, you haven't increased efficiency or the reach of the court. And I don't think we want to then go to a court that is, 6 judges or 7 judges or whatever, and some people get time off. So I'm not sure that that serves the purpose of, I don't think you can argue that we have a bigger population, therefore we need more judges. Yes, you need more judges at the federal level to handle the multitude of cases that get siphoned up to the Supreme Court. But unless you create panels within the Supreme Court, you still have one court, whether it's 9, 11, 16, whatever number you pick.
Here's another one where our time is going so rapidly. Is there any possible way that Supreme Court justices' terms could be limited to less than a lifetime?
Yes, I mean, that certainly could happen. I think it's important to understand too that part of the crisis that we're talking about also has relevance to Congress as well, because Congress could in fact be a more effective body in upholding civil liberties and civil rights. And so recently there have been proposals, and it's not just recently, for a long period of time, folks in Puerto Rico have said, we're treated like a colony. We need to be a state. DC has said that too. If you look at the combined total of the number of people between DC and Puerto Rico, they make up about 23 states. Right, so statehood really does matter in this conversation when we're thinking about balancing out the court and also the representation in Congress as well.
Here's a question. What about the Federalist Society? Isn't it time that liberals respond with a similar group?
American Constitution Society. I mean, it's not as old as the Federalist Society. It was founded less than 20 years ago, but in part, it is a response to the Federalist Society. It stands on its own, but it is an organization that is committed to upholding the rule of law and speaking to the rule of law, and tends to have a more progressive following.
Maybe that's something, going back to one of your early questions, what can people do besides vote? Maybe you can join the American Constitution Society. It does not have the funding that the Federalist Society has. It doesn't have the dark money that the Federalist Society has, but it could use some funding to get to the point where it could actually offset some of what the Federalist Society is accomplishing.
Here's a question. Could President Obama have appointed Merrick Garland even when Senate Leader McConnell refused to hold a hearing?
He could have appointed him, but he would have never been confirmed. So he would have been a recess appointment, if you could think of it that way. And that doesn't last. So what good would it have done?
And there has been, and we're going to wrap it up soon, our time is up, but there has been a talk about congressional bills to limit court terms. Do you think that there is any merit in that? Do you think that that ever might be something under consideration?
Well, it's definitely under consideration because there has been a lot of talk about how it would be phrased as legislation. And as both, as everybody else has said already, there is nothing in the Constitution that says it's a lifetime appointment. It would create an orderly transition. Everybody would know when terms were up. And of course, it's not going to affect the court now because you would never apply it retroactively, so that the current court would stay for life and it would only be any subsequent appointments. And I hate to point out the age of the liberals on the court. Justice Breyer, who I worked with during Watergate, is, I think, now one of the oldest members of the court, and one of the longest serving members of the liberal group. So he could well be the next person to leave the court. And we have to hope that he doesn't decide to leave before, during this presidency anyway.
So as we wrap up here, I would like to underscore that, yes, NCJW is a nonpartisan organization, but we are indeed a progressive organization. And the importance of an impartial, unbiased, fair judiciary is at the core of our mission, because you cannot protect any rights or freedoms without that. Currently, we are in opposition to many of the things that are being promoted and many of the actions that are taking place under the current administration. It really does not matter which party, it is the current administration, policies, and actions that we are standing in opposition to, particularly with rushing through a Supreme Court appointee while people are voting, and with the appointment and confirmation of 217 judges whose qualifications and experience are questionable. So that is the context in which we were having that discussion tonight. Not certainly endorsing a political candidate, but saying that your vote affects the courts, and that election 2020 has consequences all the way up and down the ballot. And please keep that in mind when you vote, because our rights, and as I have said so many times in the past, our lives depend on this election and on your votes. And with that, I would like to thank so much Judge Glenda Hatchett, Michelle Goodwin, Jill Wine-Banks for participating in this very, very informative and interesting discussion about the impact of our votes and the courts. Thank you again, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sylvia.
Thank you, Sylvia.